Adventurous audio. From idea to ear, we make audio an adventure. Just a word of warning, this podcast has graphic content from the outset, which you may find upsetting. On Sunday the 29th of September, 1935, a holidaymaker taking a walk in the hills above the Scottish borders town of Moffat makes a grim discovery.
On looking over the bridge, I saw lying down in the gully what I thought was part of a human body.
Sergeant Sloane, the first police officer on the scene, starts gathering up body parts.
They were about 6 feet downstream from the base of the bridge. I found 4 bundles, 2 heads, a thigh bone and 2 arms. The top of the fingers and top of the thumbs were missing, and there was also several pieces of flesh and skin lying loose. Sloane
then carefully preserves the newspaper, sheeting, children's romper suit and blouse that the body parts had been wrapped in.
The various parts of newspapers found being in a wet condition were carefully laid aside, as were the various pieces of cotton sheet, lady's blouse, child's woolen romper or knickers.
All identifying characteristics have been removed from the bodies. But given how the bodies have been disarticulated and mutilated, the police and experts suspect the murderer must have had anatomical or surgical knowledge.
I submit that the dismemberment and mutilation of the 2 subjects was not the work either of a maniac or ignorant individual, but must have been carried out by someone with previous knowledge of cutting up a body and familiar with the medical legal value used in identification.
Analysis of the maggots covering the body parts suggests they were dumped around the 16th or 17th of September, 12 to 14 days before they were found. Sergeant Sloane then discovers the newspapers wrapping the body parts are from a special edition, which was only distributed in Lancashire, where a young woman called Mary Jane Rogerson has been reported as missing since the 15th of September.
Lost Girl Mystery, vanished from doctor's house, from our own special correspondent. The disappearance of Mary Rogerson, a pretty 21-year-old nurse girl who vanished 3 weeks ago from the house of a well-known local doctor, has caused her parents, who live in Morecambe, grave anxiety. Following various inquiries, they have communicated with the police.
As we heard in the last episode, further police inquiries then discover the children's romper suit, blouse and sheeting all link both to Mary Jane Rogerson and to her employer in Lancaster, Dr. Buck Ruxton, a local GP, and his wife Isabella, who has also been reported as missing. I'm Pennie Stuart, and this is Inside Forensic Science, a case of stolen identity. Episode 4, But Is It Mary? The police decide the romper suit, which was wrapped around one of the heads in the Garden Home ravine, is a strong enough link between Mary Jane Rogerson and the Ruxton family to make an arrest.
There was a dramatic development in the Moffat Ravine mystery investigations earlier yesterday morning, when Dr. Buck Ruxton, a 36-year-old French-Indian medical practitioner of Dalton Square, Lancaster, was arrested and charged with the murder of Mary Jane Rogerson, the young nursemaid who was employed at his house and who vanished a month ago.
It came as a terrible blow to the family's hope that she might still be alive. Miss Rogerson was the nurse in charge of the 3 children of Dr. Ruxton. Mrs. Rogerson, stepmother of Miss Rogerson, told a reporter that her husband had gone to Lancaster. The news is a great shock. We clung to the hope that she was still alive and had gone on a holiday. She was a very happy girl who was fond of home life, and before she went to work in Lancaster, she used to help me in the household duties.
In the early hours of Sunday the 13th of October, just 2 weeks after the finds in Garden Home Lynn, Ruxton is charged with Mary's murder. But although the evidence is mounting up, so far the police have been unable to confirm the identity of the two bodies as belonging to Mary Rogerson and her mistress, Isabella Ruxton. With Ruxton under arrest, the forensic team turns its full attention to 2 Dalton Square, where Mary and the Ruxtons lived.
In this case, there are a number of investigative priorities that would stand out to me. One of those is we still haven't identified these bodies.
Graham Strong is a forensic operations lead with the Scottish Police Authority Forensic Services.
So you have to have some way of tying those deceased women back to the house. Now, in the case of 1935, what they did is they took 11 days to go through the house systematically and to fingerprint almost every surface they could find, and they eventually found fingerprints that led to an identification of one of the bodies. In today's methodology, I think what we'd be looking to do in that case, that initial priority, that identification of the bodies, would be to take DNA samples from the body and to take DNA samples from the house itself. So that would be things like toothbrushes are really good sources of DNA for identifying people in missing persons cases. It's something that we use quite a lot if we have a long-term high-risk missing person and there's a very good possibility that we're going to have to try and identify a body at some point later on. We will often go back to the family and ask for their toothbrush, their hairbrush, their shaving kit, to give us that option for DNA at some point later on. So the emphasis would probably not be on fingerprints in the same way as it was in 1935, because they didn't have the option of DNA.
Graham's right, they didn't. So the investigators brought in the expertise of Bertie Hammond from the recently established Glasgow Fingerprint Bureau, in what turned out to be another pioneering moment for forensic science in the UK. Kenny Lang is an operations crime manager for forensic services in the Scottish Police Authority, with a specific expertise in mark enhancement and specialist recovery of fingerprints.
In terms of Bertie Hammond and the timeline of fingerprints, he was absolutely the first person in Scotland, really, to understand the science of fingerprints as it was being taught then. So by his own admission, he went to Scotland Yard a number of times. He was kind of self-taught. He was aware of this new science that had started to come out in the world, going back to Folds and all of the stuff that he'd done. And he pioneered it certainly in Scotland, and actually he was pivotal in setting up what we now have in terms of the Scottish Criminal Records Office as it used to be, and now the fingerprint collection, if you like, that we have in Scotland. So whilst New Scotland Yard were doing it and it was starting to move out from London and them in England, Bertie was certainly the first person in Scotland to lead on that, and was absolutely a pioneer. So fingerprint science was new to an extent. Fingerprint comparison had kind of developed in the late 1800s and it slowly grew from there. But in 1935 it was still very much in its infancy. Much as we understood some of the anatomical parts of fingerprint comparison, what I specialise in terms of fingerprint recovery was certainly not as advanced as it is now, in that, in this case in particular, most of the recovered marks were visible marks that you could already see. There was a degree of enhancement back then, but that was very limited to fingerprint powders. And even compared to the powders we've got today, it was very limited. So really, really different to what happens now.
Bertie Hammond was a pioneer, and this case in particular pushed the frontier of fingerprint science and its use as evidence in 2 key ways. The first was the recovery of fingerprints from the badly decomposed body parts of what was believed to be Mary Jane Rogerson. The detective constable responsible for taking the prints was Norman Mackenzie. All the excerpts you'll hear are taken from the later trial papers.
I'm a detective constable in the Edinburgh City Police Force. On 4th of October 1935, I took fingerprints of the left hand of what was pointed out to me as body number 1. This was done at the Forensic Medicine Department of the university. On 15th October, I took palmar impressions of the same hand of the same body.
Had you to make any preparation of the hand in order to get the prints?
Yes, slightly. We soaked it in hot water.
In this case in particular, there was a degree of decomposition, which makes fingerprint recovery from a cadaver a little bit more difficult, but not impossible. So what tends to happen with decomposition is that the external layers of skin are removed, and we call that degloving, and particularly if they're in water, that process happens quicker. So if you imagine you lie in the bath, your fingers go quite wrinkly, that's because there's too much water in the skin, and what happens if that continues is the external layer of the dermis becomes really, really fragile and tends to come off quite quickly. Fingerprints are both on the very external layer and kind of the inner layers of the skin. So whilst the outer layer can come off, the ridge detail is still visible on the kind of inner dermal layers, if that makes sense. So even after degloving, we're still able to recover the fingerprints from that cadaver. In this case, what they did, I believe from the court transcript, was they put the hand into warm water, which also helps make the hand more malleable and easier to manipulate the fingers to get decent fingerprints. We can also use casting material, so dental casting material. That's less common. We tend to just stick to either the ink or the powder technique. The problem with decomposed bodies is that they tend to be very wet. So the difficulty is getting the powder or the ink to stay on the finger that allows us to recover it. Also, if it's really difficult, we can just photograph it. A close-up photograph with different lighting techniques is usually oblique lighting that allows us to be able to see the ridge detail. That's less easy because obviously the finger has a form to it and you can't always get the entire fingerprint in one photograph. So we tend to just stick to ink and powder. In terms of use in court, I believe it was the first time that was able to be successfully recovered and thereafter used to positively identify, well, in this case it was body parts that thereafter led back to identifying who the victim was.
But a fingerprint is only of use if you're able to make a comparison to a known sample. To prove that those carefully recovered prints belong to Mary, you have to be able to match them to other prints which are known to be hers. And that was where Bertie Hammond really pushed the boundaries of fingerprint science back in 1935.
If you like, the unique part of this was because the body parts, or they could put some of them together, but they were still unable to positively identify who they were. Although they had a suspicion, what they did was they went looking for articles within the house that were likely to have been touched by Mary Jane.
Bertie James Hammond. On the 13th of October 1935, I went to 2 Dalton Square, Lancaster, and there I took possession of certain articles. At the bottom of the cellar steps of that house, I found the table leaf. I also took possession of 2 bottles found in a basket of bottles. In the cellar, at the right front of the stair, I took possession of another bottle. Those all bore fingerprints.
In the circumstances of this case, it's probably easier than the situations we come across now because she was a maid and most of the items in the basement and the scullery would have been put there by her. In terms of post-cleaning, they would have been put back on the shelves by her, so that it was a reasonable assumption that any fingerprints that were found on those were likely to have been deposited by the last person to touch them that should have been her. So in terms of the thought process, it was absolutely the correct thought process, but particularly unique in that time. The circumstances, as I say, then made it slightly easier to be able to draw the inference that all of those fingerprints recovered from those items were more likely to be Mary Jane's than anybody else's. She was a maid, and it was very distinct boundaries in terms of how households behaved in that particular time.
I took another plate from a cupboard in the scullery, a decanter from the sideboard in the dining room, 2 plates from the cupboard on the left-hand side of the fireplace in the lounge, and a further plate from the centre cabinet in the wall facing the window in the drawing room. All these exhibits bore either finger or palmar prints thereon.
palm prints, in terms of the fingerprint science, they're exactly the same as fingerprints. In fact, the ridge detail is all over your fingers and your palms, and also on the soles of your feet. So we also can do similar identification from what we call plantar, which is the kind of barefoot. In terms of the comparison aspects, the same types of detail that we would look for in fingerprints also appear on the palm. The kinds of patterns on the palms are different, obviously, than what you find in the fingers, but the process of recovery and comparison is exactly the same.
You have compared the fingerprints on these articles with the fingerprints on Exhibit 182 and with the photograph that you yourself took of the left thumb of body number 1?
I have.
So we would take the known set of fingerprints. If you look at your fingers, there are various patterns. You get loops, you get arches, and you get whorls. It would be the first kind of level of detail that you would look for. So if you have a whorl as an example in your known print and you're looking at a loop, you can pretty much eliminate that one as it not being from the person that you're looking at. So that's the first level of detail that you would first look for. Is the pattern the same? Thereafter, in the pattern, if the pattern matches, what you're looking for is unique characteristics of the ridge flow, bifurcation. So that's where a single ridge forks into a different direction, either into another ridge that goes on, or just to a short ridge or a ridge ending, so where a ridge stops. And you also look for other features. The most common one is a lake, which is where a ridge would split into two, and it's almost like makes a wee O shape and then forms back and the ridge continues. So those are the kind of second level of detail that you look for. And then what you do is you look for the spatial similarities of those particular minutiae compared to your known set. So as an example, you would then count between one bifurcation, how many ridges are between that bifurcation and a ridge ending that is also of interest to you, and that needs to match in sequence for that to be an identification. And there needs to be a significant number of them for an expert to be satisfied that the two prints have been made by the same individual.
I want you to tell us, from your study of this matter, how many points of similarity you think are necessary to show that these fingerprints are of the body of which you are speaking and of no other. What is the minimum number of points required before you are satisfied that the prints were made by the fingers of that body and of no other?
In certain prints, I would be satisfied with 8. In other prints, I would be satisfied with less.
We may take the number 8 as being your minimum number, which has satisfied you?
Yes.
Fingerprint experts say it is unique. Fingerprints have been used around the world since the kind of late 1890s, starting to be categorised by forces across the world. And to date, in terms of the classification system, for all of the millions of people that have been fingerprinted, there has yet to be 2 people who have the same fingerprints. So they are classified as unique. In terms of the scrutiny of modern day statistical analysis, so similar kind of statistics that go against DNA, so you're 1 in a billion, etc., etc. The fingerprint world is moving towards that, but at the moment it's still classified as unique. I think the best comparison is that identical twins share the same DNA, but they have unique fingerprints, so they don't have the same fingerprints. So that's how unique these are, and that's been studied for a good number of years across the world, and no 2 identical twins have ever been found to have the same fingerprints. They might have similar patterns, but when you get down to those unique characteristics and the spatial similarities between them, they're absolutely unique.
In the trial, Bertie Hammond is examined in great detail about his findings and why his comparison of the chance fingerprints discovered at 2 Dalton Square with the fingerprints recovered from the cadaver prove, beyond doubt, that body 1 was Mary Jane Rogerson. If you want to read his evidence in full, you'll find links to the trial documents in the show notes. So now the police have definitive proof that Mary Rogerson is body number 1. The craniofacial superimposition, which we heard about in episode 3, while not definitive, does strongly point to body 2 as belonging to Isabella Ruxton, even more so given Isabella and Mary both disappeared around the same time from the same place. I'm conscious there's one person we haven't talked about much until this point, and that's the main suspect and the man under arrest, charged with the murder of Mary, Dr. Buck Ruxton. Buck Ruxton was born in Bombay in 1899 and was originally known as Buck Hakim. His father was a Parsi Hindu and his mother was French. He studied medicine at Bombay University, then sailed for the UK in his early 20s, eventually landing up studying at the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh. He didn't manage to pass his surgeon's exams, his written English not being fluent enough. But during his time studying in Edinburgh, he met and fell passionately in love with the sparky and charismatic Isabella Kerr, who was working as a manageress at a restaurant. Buck Hakim ended up changing his name to Buck Ruxton, and the two lived as man and wife, eventually moving to Lancaster, where Buck Ruxton set up his own practice in a substantial townhouse which doubled as their family home for Buck, Isabella and their 3 children at 2 Dalton Square. Janet Tildersley is a volunteer at Moffat Museum and curator of an exhibition about the case.
I mean, the sense I got of him was of somebody who was extremely concerned to project himself as an English gentleman. And I have no doubt that he loved Belle and that he loved his children. And I think that comes through in anything I've read or whatever. But what was out of control with him was his anger and his jealousy. But also, there is no doubt that he was a very, very good GP, and he was very well regarded in Lancashire. I don't know whether he specialised, but he was very well known in terms of obstetrics. So his safe birth record in Lancashire was really high. He often used to waive his fee for people who couldn't afford to pay. And I think that says quite a lot about him, really, because he was somebody for whom, who wanted to buy things. He wanted to buy great furniture for his house. The inside of the house at Dalton Square was enormously ornate furniture that he would purchase. He would have really well-cut suits and shirts on. He was very well regarded.
And the fact that he was well regarded meant Ruxton may well have felt he had a reputation to protect. During the years they were together, Ruxton became increasingly paranoid, angry and jealous over the independent, extrovert and fun-loving Isabella. The following is from Ruxton's diary, dated Friday the 6th of April 1934. Isabel went to the police station and lodged a complaint against me for attempted assault. I told the police all about her affairs with other men, whereupon Inspector Clark said, "Nobody is more sorry for you, Doctor, than I am." Detective Thompson said, "Doctor, I know you are heartbroken, but forgive and forget." She threatened to go away to Edinburgh, but at last changed her mind, and in the presence of Detective Thompson, promised not to have anything to do with that man. Interestingly, Detective Inspector William Thompson remembers it quite differently.
On 6 April 1934, Mrs. Ruxton came into my office in Lancaster and made a statement. Afterwards, Dr. Ruxton came in accompanied by Detective Sergeant Stainton. He waved his arms in the air, commenced to shriek and foam at the mouth. I tried to calm him and he said, "My wife has been unfaithful. I will kill her if it continues." I took him into another room and he said, "My wife is breaking my heart." He then calmed down, and I went and had a talk with Mrs. Ruxton. On returning to Dr. Ruxton, I told him that his wife insisted on leaving him and asked him if he would give her some money to pay her fare to Edinburgh. He gave her £3. Dr. Ruxton then left, and I accompanied Mrs. Ruxton to her house and into a bedroom at 2 Dalton Square, where she packed some clothes. We went into a small room on the right, and Dr. Ruxton came up and passed her a note, which she read. I had a conversation with her, and later Dr. Ruxton came upstairs, and they had a conversation together. After Dr. Ruxton went downstairs, she agreed to stay, and I left the house.
Eliza Hunter. I was employed as a domestic servant at 2 Dalton Square, where I had been since July 1934. I slept in the same room as Mary Rogerson on the top floor in a room at the back. Mrs. Ruxton occupied a room facing the front on the left, and the children slept in the same room. Dr. Ruxton slept in a room on the right on the same floor. The conditions in the house were most unhappy, and Dr. and Mrs. Ruxton did not agree with one another. I remember Mrs. Ruxton leaving the house on one occasion with all her clothes. She was away only one day, and Dr. Ruxton said he would bring her back to the mortuary. He asked Mary Rogerson if she would be the mother of his children from then on. I remember an incident that happened 3 or 4 months before I left. One morning, Mrs. Ruxton called me, and when I went into her bedroom, the doctor had her down on the bed with his arms around her neck. He said it was none of my business and I had to leave the room. Previous to this, I was in the backyard when Mrs. Ruxton called me from the kitchen. I went in and she said the doctor had a knife at her throat. I heard the knife click as if it was being closed. The doctor possessed a white knife, but when Mrs. Ruxton said that, he said he had no knife. I said that he had because I'd heard it click. I used to make the doctor's bed. I have seen a revolver there under his pillow.
I am William Norman Wilson. I am a police constable in the Lancaster Borough Police Force. On 25th of May last year, I went to Dr. Ruxton's house in answer to a telephone message. I found Dr. and Mrs. Ruxton there. Dr. Ruxton was in a very excitable state, behaving like a man insane. He said, "I will commit 2 murders in Dalton Square tonight." Sergeant Stainton arrived and quietened him somewhat. Dr. Ruxton said he was going to the police court on Monday morning to take out a summons against a man who had enticed away his wife's affections.
I'm Charlotte Smith. I was employed as a day woman by Dr. and Mrs. Ruxton for 6 months in 1933. I used to go there at 7:30. Mary Rogerson was there the whole time I was there. One Sunday, towards the end of November 1933, Mrs. Ruxton came down to the kitchen where I was working. She was crying terribly and holding her left arm, which was badly bruised. At lunchtime, Mrs. Ruxton said she would go away, and Dr. Ruxton said, "You will not go away." He said he would watch that she did not take the children. She was not a fit woman to have them.
Whatever the truth of their relationship behind closed doors, Isabella's sister, Jeannie Nelson, was a regular witness to the fallout.
Do you remember getting a telegram in 1932 and going to Lancaster? When you got to Lancaster, in what state did you find your sister and the doctor?
Well, at one time I went on receipt of a telegram, and when I arrived in Lancaster, the doctor met me at the door and took me into his consulting room, and he told me my sister had tried to gas herself. Of course, I felt surely there was some reason, and I asked him if he was at fault himself in any way. He said no. He was a loving husband, and she was trying to ruin him by trying to get him into trouble by gassing herself. My sister said there had been an accident, but he refused to believe it was an accident at first and slapped her face while she was in bed and said, "Come on now, the truth, you must tell the truth." He was very excited, and of course he meant her to say she had done it, but she would not own up to doing it herself.
You were very fond of your sister, I take it, and in the various disputes that arose between your sister and Dr. Ruxton, I think you rather sided with her.
Oh, naturally, but not altogether or unjustly. I sometimes reasoned with her. The disputes were fairly frequent.
Would you describe your sister as highly impulsive and excitable?
Oh, yes, I would. Excitable to a point.
Apt to act on the spur of the moment?
Not without someone behind her. She was impulsive. She had impulses, but she was not one that acted very often on her own.
There is much more evidence relating to Buck and Isabella Ruxton's relationship in the trial papers. If you want to read them in more detail, then follow the link in the show notes. While the stories of the Ruxtons' tempestuous relationship is of significance to the case, it doesn't explain why Buck Ruxton might have murdered Mary Jane Rogerson, or indeed prove he murdered either of the women. So can the forensic evidence help to prove what happened to Mary and Isabella and where it happened? Coming up in the next episode.
The next priority, I suppose, having identified and being able to tie those bodies back to that locus, is then to say to, and it's principally going to be a biologist in this case, can you use your skills to try and identify a course of events? Can you identify within this house if there's a locus of an assault? Can you identify within this house whether there is evidence of a clean-up?
In episode 4 of Inside Forensic Science, A Case of Stolen Identity, the experts were Graham Strong, Janet Tildesley and Kenny Lang. The actors were Yana Miller, Alan Richardson, Chris Young, Sam Young, Neil Wallace, Dan Holland, Alan Wall, Jake Lee, Nick Small, Ali Cameron, Andy Utley, Heather Duran and Pam McIntosh. Inside Forensic Science is written and narrated by me, Pennie Stuart. The story consultants and researchers are Heather Duran and Clara Morris. The sound mix is by Steve Bull. Inside Forensic Science is an Adventurous audio production for the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee and is funded by the Leverhulme Trust.